Hello and welcome to another episode of Soul Nectar Show, that show that talks about all things essence, where we sit around the campfire and we share amazing stories of our life journeys that inspire us to hear, someone else's life story and things that they overcame and how they processed it and how they went about finding meaning in their life. And I love those kind of stories. I'm your host, Carrie Hummingbird. And I love helping people to take the first few steps on that sacred journey of their own, that conversation with the divine that is always happening. And when we can tune into it a different way, things become miraculous and fascinating and mystical. And those are the kinds of journeys I like to help people lead in their lives. And today I've got a guest on my show who also loves people's stories, Carolyn Lambert. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So Carolyn is an award-winning writer and former journalist, and she's a writing collaborator now. She collaborates with people as a ghostwriter and a book coach to help people to write their own stories so they can create and share their legacy. And she's got some endless curiosity about people's life journeys, just like I do. So as we were talking when we first met, I was so enraptured by your love of story because I share that with you. I love people's stories. I love helping them see the greater picture of their story as well. And, I definitely, in my own journey I wrote my memoir, Awakening to Me. And the process of writing it was a 2-year journey of like doing the spiritual work to become the person that loved herself at the end of that journey. And I use it as my writing process. And I know that this is like something that you help people do. So how did you figure out that this is what you wanted to do with your life? Like, what's your story?
Well, my love of stories started very young. I mean, the first, one of my earliest memories is having my dad sit by the side of my bed every night before I went to bed and telling me stories that his parents told him. And I was enraptured by those stories. And I went quite naturally into writing. But as you mentioned, I was first a journalist. And after many years of that, I was really I wanted to write something that was more about people and less about analytics, basically, or less about big ideas and more about people's lives and feelings. And so I was looking for a way to kind of transition into that. And at the same time, my life took an unexpected turn. Which really reinforced this new direction. So what happened is actually, I remember the exact date, but on December 19th, 2011, I was at the movie theater with my husband, and I had kept my phone with me. I was expecting a call, and the call came while I was watching the movie, and I stepped out to take it. And what I was told is that my biopsy results were in and that I had been diagnosed with cancer. And my first reaction was one of utter disbelief. It was like, there's no way I can have cancer. So first, because I felt I was too young. I was 41. I had a daughter who was 1 year old. And second, because my mother had cancer and had died of cancer many years before. And for some reason in my mind, what I had decided is that I would never have cancer because I was nothing like my mother.
Nothing like my mother.
And it was, and so that was, and it was, of course, completely non-logical, nonsensical. Because of course I could have, I could have cancer, and the proof was actually there. But also, it was that relationship with my mother was an interesting one because it was a twist of fate that really forced me to re-examine that assumption. what happened is, and the reason why I say, I was nothing like my mother, I love my mother dearly. So it's not like, it's nothing around that. But I felt we were very different people. And the reason for that is she was, although I grew up with her and I spent a lot of time with her, I felt like I didn't really know who she was. She was very guarded, and she was not the kind of person to share her feelings. And so I really didn't know, what she made of her life, whether she was happy or sad, or what her dreams were, and really what when she looked at her life, what she made of it, whether she felt like she'd had a good life or not. And I thought that was quite different from that, different generation, different personality. And to me, it was, it was inconceivable that I would have cancer. But yet, here I was, diagnosed of exactly the same cancer, in exactly the same spot. It was breast cancer. It was, my left breast, at exactly the same age my mother had been diagnosed.
Wow, that's like ancestral pattern. From my work and my understanding, like it's an example of ancestral patterns running through the DNA. It's like your ancestors' story live on through you.
Exactly. It was also, I felt that I was retracing my mother's steps, and it was there looking me in the, really staring me in the face, because not only were there these weird parallels, on top of that, I ended up receiving exactly the same treatment as she had been receiving 30 years prior. And she had died of cancer, a long time before I was diagnosed. But it was so eerie that it really woke me up from my delusion, basically. And I was like, well, I have to look at this. I mean, perhaps after all, I am a lot more like my mother than I thought I was.
And I got to tell you that that's a journey so many of us go on as women, myself included. Like we think we're nothing like our moms, but then we actually have to open to the possibility. Like my dad used to always say, you guys are like exactly the same. And we'd both be like, no, we're not. I'm nothing like her. Just to share my 2
Exactly.
cents. But so talk about how you had to explore this, and how did you do that? How did you explore it?
So it was, well, first it was this realization. I was like, okay, now fate is thumbing its nose at me, quite literally. It's like, ha, you see, you thought you were nothing like her, but hey, I'm going to send you, a wake-up call. And so there was several things happened. So what I decided is, first I would examine my own life, thinking, okay, how did I end up here? How did I end up at age 41 diagnosed with cancer? What is it in my life? And I decided, and it was a very conscious decision of using this diagnosis to change. And that's what I wanted. And I decided, okay, you know what? I'm going to use this to make those changes that kind of at the back of my mind, I kind of thought that probably this is something I would change about myself, but never quite kind of got around to it. And I'm like, okay, that's it. If I want, I've taken a wrong turn somewhere. So let's look back and see, what it is that I want to change about myself and about my life, to make sure that I redirect, and that I take a path where, my body doesn't have to remind me, hey, wake up, there's something wrong here. And I didn't want to, so I made the decision to use it for that. I was like, okay, yeah, that's a wake up call. There is something for it. And bizarrely, I never thought that I would die. It might be completely delusional. I can't exclude that, because my mother died of that very cancer. But again, I decided, no, you know what? I know it's not my path. I know there's something for me to learn. It's not about, okay, that's the end, that's it. No, there is something that I haven't seen or paid attention to that I have to learn in this. So what is it? So that was the first the kind of first area of exploration for me, of looking back at my life. And then the second thing is that, okay, well, if I'm more like my mother than I thought, well, then perhaps I should get to know her better. Because again, as you know, as I was mentioning, I realized I didn't really know very well who she was, at a more emotional level. And so that was not easy because she was no longer with us. And so I started talking to people who knew her and who knew her well before she got married and before she had children. So people who grew up with her, some family, some friends. And I also went on a pilgrimage with with both my sisters, and a cousin of my mother's who had grown up with her. And I had never visited the town where she was born and where she grew up, because she was born and she grew up in Morocco when it was still I'm French, so when it was still a French territory. And so we traveled to Morocco, and we went, guided by her cousin. We went to visit the sites that had been important to her. So we found the house where, sorry, my cat is coming to visit us, actually. Of the school, obviously. So we went to visit the house that she grew up in, and it was miraculous. The house was still there. There were high rises all around it, and there was this little part of the block where there were still a few houses left back from that time. And my mother was born in the 30s. The house was still there. And
Wow.
so it was extraordinary. And so
did you get to walk inside the house where your mom lived?
We did, because the family was, we were standing in front of the house. And so some people who lived in the house kind of came out and said, well, can we help you? And so we explained. And they remembered my mother because she had come and visited, quite a few years before. But again, another miracle number two, besides the fact that the house was still there, it was still the same family that had actually gotten the house from my grandparents. So they remembered my grandparents. They remembered my mother from a previous visit. And so they invited us in. It's like, yes, please, come in, come in. So they gave us a tour of the house. And we ended up sitting, they invited us for tea and, for cakes. And so we ended up sitting in the room that used to be my mother's bedroom.
Wow.
That had become a kind of a reception, a kind of a tea room, basically. And it was unbelievable. It was, and I kept on thinking, I can't believe, I'm sitting here where my mother as a teenager, where she spent all those years and where she used to sleep and perhaps dream. And so that was unbelievable. So we visited her house. We went back to the school she attended that was still there. We walked those halls. And then we went to a number of other places as well, where she used to go on holidays in the summer. We went to the university that she had attended. And so we went through all these places. And then we also spent a lot of time talking, of course, about her, and asking that cousin to shed some light over who she had been, and perhaps, what she had, when she was a teenager, when she was a young woman, what she thought her life would be and the plans that she had. It turns out that, we couldn't find out very much because even back then, what I learned through that process, it was not only with us, her children, that she was quite guarded, but just in general. She was not someone who shared her feelings very much. I think it was a mix of personality, and also, she was from a generation where this was not something that was done. It was not something that was valued, that, you didn't spend, it was not a good thing to spend time thinking about feeling, let alone share them with anyone. So you just kind of got on and kind of do things. and did things. And so she was very much from, I think, from that generation and from that school of thought. And so, you know, it put in really stark, it shed a very bright light to the fact that, well, it was in a way, it was a bit late. I couldn't find out all these things from her, and I could no longer ask her. She had left no journal. There were no letters. There were lots of people from her generation, my dad included, that were also gone. And I felt like it was, and I feel that it's, you know, it's such a loss. And so then what I wanted to do is combine basically this life experience that I was going through with what I do and the craft that I've developed over many years, which is writing, and combine that to the service of in the service of other people. And I felt that that memoirs and this almost, you know, this excuse of writing a book is such a great tool for us to think back, to examine our lives, especially when doing it with someone else. And that's why I like assisting people who want to go through that process, because, you know, having another person asking you questions, and also perhaps, you know, pointing out links and patterns that you don't always see yourself when you're looking at your own life. And so you need sometimes a bit of an outsider or a mirror or another pair of eyes to say, oh, that's interesting. You know, I see that, you know, you telling me that you did this, but it reminds me of this other story you told me. And so I find that it's a very cathartic process. And it's such a blessing for me to be able to do that with other people, and also to help them leave something behind. Because I would so love now to have something from my mother, which I don't have. And so if I can help other families, other people do that, either, you know, they write their book and so that they have something that they leave for their children and their grandchildren. So just that in itself, I think is an incredible gift. Or even often what I find when I go through this process with people I work with is that other family members get involved. Mm-hmm. And so what happens is that it creates conversations within families, and that I find as well is wonderful, heartwarming to me. To me, this is very important. And so if I can do, being able to do what I can to foster that for other people and in other families, I feel incredibly lucky.
You know, I think, I really appreciate what you do, and I appreciate the heartfelt reason why you do it. Is like, now I'm really getting it. You do what you do because you really wanted to know who your mother was, and she kind of left no trace. Like she had her own private experience that she didn't really share with a lot of people. And so it's kind of like looking into the mystery of, who was this person that was my mother? I don't even know who she is. That's really beautiful.
And a lot of it is now. So thank you first.
Yeah.
And so I found out something. So it's a bit like a treasure hunt. You know, I was able to piece a few things together, but there are so many holes that will never be filled. And so I look at her, and here's someone that with whom I spend a lot of time. So when I think then one generation back, I look at my grandparents, and so I have even more questions now. And so I have again bits and pieces of their story, but it's a similar thing. I know even less about them. And then when I think about their parents, my great grandparents, I don't even know their names, and I know nothing. I know zero of their story. And so I look back, and all this human experience has vanished without a trace. And I would love to be able to read something that would tell me, oh, these are the things that, you know, these were the concerns or the fears or the hopes or the dreams of these people. This is, you know, what they learned through their experience, this is how they looked at their lives. And I find it such a gift to have something like that.
You know, it really is. I got to say, on my journey, my mom actually does a lot of ancestry work. So ancestry.com is like her favorite platform. So she just did years of work on it. And she put together these albums of family history, like making all the connections. And in order to do that, she had to pour through like all of these records, like all these handwritten records from, municipalities and, throughout time, and like find a person's name to like substantiate that it is in fact this person is a relation, and then put it all up there in Ancestry and let other people make the connections. And it's tedious work, but she did that. But even that, like even knowing their names and their birth dates and their records and their marriage, all of that, it just doesn't even tell the story of who they are, though. It still doesn't tell the story, and people get lost. Like we had family story, but we can't substantiate it, that my great grandmother on my grandfather's side, my mom's dad, was full-blooded Cherokee. But at the time, it was kind of around the Trail of Tears, the timing of it. And at the time, it was safer for her she could pass for white. So it was safer for her to have a life with this white man that she met and to change her name and to pretend, thereby losing like all that heritage. So like generations later, that decision that she made might have saved her and might have like helped her build a life. But did she ever predict that generations later would come me, a person who wanted her ancestry, who wanted to be connected with my Cherokee heritage? She probably never even thought about that. So it's interesting how we don't realize how significant we are to our forward ancestry, to our descendants.
Absolutely. And I find that, the interest that people have around ancestry.com or around these kinds of research really moving. And to me, it illustrates how hungry people are for that knowledge. But you're absolutely right. What you say is that, what we can find is a family tree and some facts and some dates. But what we can't fill in, I mean, except for the lucky few that might have, journals or letters, or is that emotional side and who these people really were. We may find out where they were born and at what time, perhaps where they lived, who they married, how many children they had. But often that's about it. Perhaps if they moved, where they lived. But it's very difficult on that, because that research is all about these kinds of facts. But there's often everything else. So we can delineate their lives, but we can't put the color in. We don't really know. We can't put the emotional component in it.
So
and
when you visited your mom's house in Morocco, did you notice anything, like when you were sitting in her bedroom? Like, did any sort of intuitive hits or insights come in as you were sitting there, or was it just sort of all gone?
I wouldn't say it wasn't gone. But it was almost like an echo. It was like a faint. It was not a bolt of lightning either, of like, oh, super great insight. No, but it was in her bedroom, but also in the city, because what I find incredibly in many parts of the city center, it's still, in many areas still look very much like it was like in the 40s or 50s. It hasn't changed that much. And as I was walking, I could feel her walk those streets. So it's in that sense that, it was very helpful for me to go there first to visualize where she had spent her formative years, but also I could feel her, I could imagine her walking, I could feel her sitting, on the terrace of those cafes. I could see her at school, and so same in her bedroom. I could see her I could sense her in that house. But it was a kind of faint echo, rather than suddenly having this massive insight. Oh, I know exactly who she was. No. So it helps.
It helps to visit. I would say, for my own journey, because I wanted to be reconnected with my my Cherokee ancestry, and I didn't have any way in the third dimension to make that happen, like in this physical, this particular incarnation. So what I ended up doing was I went to this reenactment village in the Smoky Mountains for the Cherokee, and I just started asking around, like, is there a shaman, here that can help me get reconnected, like in a meditative space, like in an imagination space, or in the, what other fifth dimension, another space. And I actually got that. Like, it was a little bit trippy because I finally, through the circle of asking, got connected with someone who, by the way, hadn't really been working there for a while and just happened to pop back in that day. You know how it is.
Incredible.
Got connected with that guy, and he actually said, I'll meet you in the parking lot after my shift is done in 30 minutes. So I start walking out with my boys, and all of a sudden it felt like a softball of energy got flung in through the back of my head, which I now know is like the seat of the soul, right at the base of your skull, where your skull meets your neck. I
Mm-hmm.
subsequently found that out. Well, it made me like sort of lightheaded and dizzy and disoriented, and I had to sit down. But it was really a piece of my soul, maybe even my history. It's hard to explain, but maybe a part of my soul memory, or part of my ancestry coming back in to support me. And ever since then, I started remembering another lifetime where I was Cherokee, where I was this, Cherokee chief on the path, the Trail of Tears. And I remember it so profoundly that it would cause me like huge grief. I would just cry anytime I would think of it. So it's like I restored a piece of me, but it's like you say, it's an echo. It's like I'm very aware now that I have the support of my ancestry on that side, and I can feel it, and I notice the synchronistic connections that happened in my life because of that reconnection. I notice the things that I remember about myself because of that moment, that I just know it's true inside of me, but I couldn't like scientifically prove it if I had to do that. There's no way for me to like go prove like, oh, this is who I was, or yes, I'm reconnected. It's a knowing. So I think that, the pathway to, like you're suggesting, is like it's paying attention to that echo through time, and then allowing yourself to trust your imagination and your feelings, the sort of subtler bodies that are telling you things about your mom, right?
Absolutely. And well, thank you for sharing your story. This must have been a profound
It was
experience.
mystical, to say the least.
Incredible story. But yeah, I've come to terms, and I've accepted the fact that that there are all these things I probably will never know. These holes I won't be able to fill with someone telling me, oh, okay, this is, and that's so I've accepted that, and that's okay. I've made my peace with it. And as you say, I just now can also choose, to remember her in the way I want, and choose to believe things about who she was, and so I have these breadcrumbs, and it's already more than I had, and it's enough. It's enough for me at the moment. I've accepted that. Okay, that's all I'm going to get, and that's okay. And as you say, I can build on it, and just either imagine or follow these echoes, and stay with those feelings, as opposed to, oh, okay, I know for sure this is what she thought at that particular point in time.
What I
But
love
if
is that you were a journalist, and journalists are trained to be precise and objective and fact finders. But what you're really describing now is beyond. It's like that tapping into those feelings, or echoes, like you call them, and incorporating that into your imagination and your story that you choose to create about your mom.
Yes, and it's a mix of both, because there is research, and that's a part that I also really enjoy doing. I love history. I love, doing all these research, and I do that also with and for people that I'm lucky enough to work with, and I love doing that. But there's a point. There are limits where you reach the end of that. And so what do you do, once you've reached that limit and you have gathered all the facts and all the stories that you can, and then there is still, that space. So yes, this is a combination of both of these things. And so for people who do that, of course, when they're still alive, and then it means that, for their children and grandchildren, I mean, yes, there may be still some space, because they may have questions later on that you haven't thought about. But if you leave some record of your life, so not only what happened, but also, again, what you've learned, and your interpretation of your life, what meaning do you ascribe to your journey, that takes care of a lot of those kind of blank spaces that your children and your grandchildren and your great grandchildren, will most likely face at some point in their lives. And so being able to do that and to pass this on, I think is so beautiful. And it reminds me, I used to live in Africa, and all these oral traditions, and in particular in the Somali traditions, of all these oral traditions of people kind of passing on stories about their ancestors and knowing who your ancestors were, is very important in a lot of oral cultures, and I see why. I can see why. It's such a beautiful thing to pass on. But this is something that in a lot of kind of Western cultures is kind of has disappeared, basically, and is largely gone.
Yeah, and the verbal, telling the story. Well, what's interesting is that a couple things came to mind when you were talking. So I'm hopefully not too jumbled, but there's a couple things that I'm really interested by. One of them is that when people are writing their story, it's like interesting to see how they thought of themselves, because really the only place that anybody can write things from is from their own little, what we call the assemblage point, which is like the window through which they perceive reality, and your assemblage point is different than anybody else's. So in your family, everybody's got a different assemblage point. So to know like how that person perceives their life through their assemblage point, that's what they can share. They can share that. And like I was thinking about your cousin, your mom's cousin sharing, viewpoints about your mom. It can only be from their assemblage point into your mom's life, because, that's the only lens through which they can see. So it's kind of interesting, this idea of realizing that you're communicating your view on your life is like through your assemblage point, your view, your perceptual filter is actually really important to your descendants. Like you wouldn't realize how important it is for your descendants to really know what you thought about your life and who you thought you were and what you made of your journey, like how you created the story of your life.
Absolutely, because the way our brains work is to, well, precisely to create stories around events. And so the same people could go through the same events and have an entirely different interpretation of them. So by looking at someone's life, just looking at the facts, it's almost impossible to figure out what this particular person made of those facts. It's the glass half empty and half full, perspective. You could have very, very different perspectives on exactly the same events. And I find that actually going through that, interestingly, the process of writing a memoir and examining your life gives you a chance to change that perspective and to reframe that picture. because the facts are not going to change. The facts are the facts. But the stories you've told yourselves about what they mean, and as a result, what that means for your life, that you can change. And that's something I've gone through after, you know, my cancer diagnosis. When I was telling you earlier that I re-examined my life, there was a lot of that. Oh, okay. I realized all the stories and all that I had been carrying with me, that were stories I was telling myself often. One interpretation of a series of facts, or one interpretation of how people had behaved or what they had said, and realizing that actually I could make a choice to look at these things in an entirely different light and come up with an entirely different story, that instead of weighing on me, could actually support me and move me forward. And you know, writing a memoir, for people who are open to that process, is a fantastic opportunity to do just that. And again, in particular, when you do it also with someone else. And so I find that incredibly moving, you know, working with people in that way.
Yeah, I had to support that because when I wrote my memoir, I started writing it in real time because I got this download. Spirit said, start writing. You're charting the course out of madness. I was like, okay, sure. And I'd had just enough spiritual training, like to go, okay, I'm going to listen to this voice that says that. I'm going to start doing it. You know, so I started writing, and I started writing about my story as it was unfolding, like the lessons I was learning, the experiences I was having, the mystical moments, the realizations, and then how I was changing myself. And I started it was like documenting my healing journey. And I did it over 2 years, and I kept trying to write the last chapter, and there wasn't the last chapter yet. I had to keep going. That was so annoying. But I was like, okay, I love myself, right? And then like the new thing would come in, and I was like, oh, and I would know that's part of the story. Dang it, here comes the next chapter. But the cool thing is years later, I actually periodically go back and read that book. And if I hadn't have written down my perspective along the way, I would never believe that I thought about life that way as the person I am today. That's how much I've changed since I started writing that book. I started writing that book in 2012. I published it in 2014. And now it's 2019. I wouldn't even believe that I thought that way about life if I hadn't written it down. It's amazing how the mind changes. Like the mind, especially if you're in transformation mode, and you're not like the mode that I was in before I wrote the memoir was very much like repeating the story to keep it alive, right? Like I keep telling the same story about my history, about myself, or about my mother, or about whoever in my life. I would just tell the whole story over and over and over again, exactly the same way. And then that would cement it, you know, so everything would stay the same. So what I learned through the transformation process is don't do that. I learned through the transformation process is almost like spirit of death. Take the whole thing away, bam, and then like I'll open to see what's true today. And then start telling a story based on what's true today. And then that would change me as a person. Every single day I would keep evolving and transforming through that process. So my journey of transformation has continued beyond that first book to the point where now, like literally, like the last time I picked it up to read it was a year and a half ago. And I was just like, what? I used to think about life that way? Really? And no wonder my family, my ex-husband and my family, like, they don't believe me because they're like, no, wait, somebody changes that fast. They are used to the paradigm of people tell the same story over and over and over again. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, that was me. You're right. And I'm not that way anymore. Like, I see life because I allowed myself to change the story. So talk a little bit about that as like coming forward.
Yes, no, and there are you know, several thoughts I had, you know, when I was listening to you speak. First, writing a memoir is exactly, you know, that it's formalizing what you were just describing of how we tell the story. Because when you decide to write a memoir, you have choices to make of how you tell the story. What do you put the focus on? What interpretation do you put on things? And you have all these choices to make. And the way you tell the story influences very much the way you look at your life. And you can tell the story, the same story, in many different ways, which means you can look back at your life in many different ways. And so you could change your perspective on that. Again, something that if you feel that it's something that, has been weighing on you, you can decide to shift that to something that is much more supportive and lifts that weight off your shoulders. But the second thing as well, also echoing to what you said, is that we forget what we used to think or how we used to be, because often, even when changes are fast, often they're gradual. It's not like you wake up suddenly one morning and zoop, you're an entirely different person. And so it's like, living with children, you don't see them grow every day, and yet they change a little bit every day. But because it's subtle and it's gradual, it's only when you look back at pictures from 2-3 years ago that you're like, oh my God, yeah, they've changed. And it's a bit like that for us as well. Because we live with ourselves every day, and so we change a little bit, but we don't really see it necessarily unless we think back of what was I like, or unless we read back things we've written 5 or 10 years ago, and it's like, oh my God, I can't believe this. And I see that a lot with people in my writing collaboration. So, for example, I was, I worked with a gentleman, a Vietnam veteran and Medal of Honor recipient, on his memoir, and he was telling me. So, I was asking him a lot of questions, and he was telling me what he remembered his state of mind to be when he was a young man, at a particular moment when he went through boot camp and when he went to Vietnam. And then, so that was his memory of today, of what he felt like and what he thought. But those memories are very influenced by who we are today. And it was so telling to then he found letters, a whole bunch of letters that his mother had kept, that he had written as a young man to his parents when he was in boot camp. Then he was in Vietnam. It was a treasure trove of material, and he found them in an old attic, and he hadn't seen them. So I was able to use those letters to help write the book and to establish, well, not only the facts but also his mindset. And he was quite different from what he remembered his mindset to be. And so it was a very kind of tangible proof of what the phenomenon you've just described, of like, we think we remember what we felt like, and to some extent we do, but not very accurately, of who we were and what we thought when we 20 years ago or 10 years ago. And it's only in the writing, and when we have traces that we're able to go back to, that we can find an accurate kind of reading of that.
And that explains why people get in arguments all the time about, well, it didn't happen that way, it happened this way. Well, it's like, because you don't even remember how it happened, actually. You think you remember how it happened. You just think you do. But you only are operating from this current lens on the history and whatever version of it you decided to start telling. And so all of it is sort of like dust in the wind. But it makes us feel better if we think that, we can access some good story that we want to hear. So I feel like there's like essence, and I think we can tap into the essence of a person by hearing their words or their story, or by memory or photos or things like that. And like the memoir you're talking about is really that allowing somebody to tap into an essence of you, and like just realize that the details probably aren't going to be 100% accurate, but the essence is there, and that's the thing we're really looking for, is that contact with the essence.
Well, and it's so well put. So thank you for saying that, because you're right. It's the right word for it. It's essence, and that's a question I get from people all the time. It's like, but how can I write my memoir and in particular, how can I write dialogue in a memoir? Because I don't remember exactly what was said. I don't remember if it was, and and that's exactly what I try to explain, is that, well, no one expects that it's going to be, when people read memoir, no one expects that it's going to be the exact words that were spoken, or that it was, exactly what happened. What matters is what you remember, because it is, again, it's first, as you said, it's transmitting the essence of who you are, but it's also, you're telling a story as you remember it and as you interpreted it, and that's the understanding that that kind of underlies a memoir, and it's not like, you're looking for you're producing a documentary. There's no way of doing that.
People are going to discredit you. You know what I love about it is that it's your ability, your memoir or your book is your ability to tell your story, how you viewed it from your lens and your perception, and leave your legacy and your message that you want to leave with your ancestors and your descendants. And it's not up for debate. It's your story. And
yeah,
that's
exactly
what I love about it. You get to have your voice expressed.
I was going to say that exact same word. It's your voice as well, because it's telling your story in and your voice and how you express yourself is also, it also gives a lot of clues as to who you are, your sense of humor, how you interpret things. And so even, if someone reads it 2 generations later, later, they're going to have a really good clue as to who you were just by reading your words and the words that you've written. It's your voice kind of echoing down the generations.
That's beautiful. Well, I love this. What a great conversation about your life story and how it changes and transformation and history. And we covered a lot of ground today about this dialogue. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been such a pleasure, because I love talking about this, and and I love, again, as I said, working with people, because, and one other thing that people often tell me is like, but how can I do this? I'm not a writer. I've never written a book. I don't know, how to do it. And that's why, I'm here. And that's why I've developed as well a process that, that helps people to do that, whether they want to do it with me or with someone else or by themselves, but a process that is a step-by-step process to help people then do that and not feel from the onset completely overwhelmed with like, oh my God, where do I start? And I don't know how to do this.
Oh yeah, I was going to ask you, how do people work with you? So is that available as a separate offering, or do you coach people through that? How does that work?
Yeah, so I've actually written a book that lays that on paper. It's called Your Legacy in a Book. And so that's available on Amazon, and that's the kind of bare bones of the process. And so people can start with that. That's already, that lays out the step-by-step approach. And this is very much the system I use when I coach people, or whether I coach or I ghostwrite for them. It's a similar process. What changes is who holds the pen and who does the writing, but the process is similar. The process of collaboration is similar. And so it gives an idea of what the approach is. Of course, when I work with people one-on-one, then I adjust it because every story is different, every person is different. And so I adjust the kind of principles to every case and every person and every story. So the one-on-one work gives me a lot more latitude, and gives us a lot more latitude to do that together. And then people can reach me through my website. It's www.carolinelambert.com. My name, easy. They'll find out also a little bit more about who I am and some of the collaborations that I was lucky to be involved in. And I'm working on putting together an online program that will be something that's going to be in between, the book, which is, something to help you get started by yourself, and the one-on-one work. So in between, there will be that online program, which is going to be, something with much more, of course, support, but a group coaching program. So that is to come within the next few months.
That sounds amazing. I love that. How awesome. Well, I really love that you do what you do, and I love stories. As I said, I love people's stories. And if you're thinking, well, I don't know if my story's going to be all that compelling or interesting, like you'd be surprised. You can't even see your own story. That's why you need somebody like Caroline to help you see it, because seriously, you got some interesting stuff, and your ancestors, your descendants want to know about it. So I encourage you to check it out. Yeah.
As I tell my clients, everyone has a story.
Everybody has a story worth telling. And the whole time you've been talking, I've been sitting here like, maybe this is the answer with my mom. Maybe because I'm a writer. I just got out there and wrote my story. Like I just am built this way. I just can start, I can just do it. But I feel like I feel like especially women, I feel like every woman's voice needs to be heard right now on the planet, because we're all telling a unique story and we're shifting into the divine consciousness of the feminine. And I feel like every woman's story is pertinent. It holds a piece of the key for so many people. And I know my mom's generation, they had a lot of challenges. I mean, she's 70 something now, like she went through the 60s. She went through like all the civil rights stuff. She went through all the struggle, and to, become part of that generation where you can have a career and you can get a college education and you can vote and you can get out there and start, being strident and, have your voice be heard. And then you're also like sort of caught in between, because, the generation before taught you like, don't talk about your stuff. And then we show up in our generation, right? Like I'm going to be 50. We show up and we're like, just tell everybody everything all over social media. And my mom is just like, what? Like, you can't do that. You're supposed to tell your story, your dirty laundry, like everywhere. And at one point she said to me, well, I'm going to tell my story. And I was like, well, good. You should tell your story. I'm not holding you back. So the whole time you were talking, I was like, oh gosh, I wonder if I could afford Caroline. Just have my mom tell her story, that would be such a blessing to have her like get it off her chest, like, and be heard. Because what do we all want? We all want to be heard and witnessed.
Yeah. And perhaps also, another way to think about it. Well, first, I mean, I'm so moved that it made you think of your mom.
Been thinking of that the whole time. I was like, oh.
But another thought as well is perhaps it's something that you could do with her.
I know. I thought about that.
Using the book as a roadmap, and
some of the things she wants to say are like, my daughter is a real pain in the ass.
Well, so sometimes it works, and sometimes it also, as you said, there are some constraints, because sometimes your parent might feel more comfortable with a complete stranger.
Somebody like you who's not threatening.
Than with the offspring.
Believe it or not, I'm threatening. You know how it is, perceptual filters. But no, I appreciate what you're saying, and I think that it's just something to consider. A gift for your loved one who was part of that generation. They were told that they couldn't speak up, that they really should hide their feelings or hide their story or be ashamed of it somehow, or that's so icky. And I feel like our generation has been really blessed with this ability to come out and be free to speak, to be free to share our perspective. And so just something to think about for your mom, your older generation. Anyway.
Yes, and that's why I love considering myself as a family historian in a way, because it's often, these books are often not for most people write them not for wide consumption. They write them to leave a legacy behind, and it's a beautiful thing. So I'm here.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll see what I can make the mountain come to Muhammad. All right. Well, I'll give you guys an update later if there's one to share. Okay, so thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. I always leave people with kisses. You're welcome to join me if you want, but here they come. You ready, everybody? Get ready for kisses. Mm.
Thank you.
Have a wonderful week, everybody. I hope you were inspired to tell your story and reach out to Carolyn. And I hope to see you next time on Soul Nectar Show.